Hello, I'm Barry James, and this is lesson 2 for our case study. Just for the introduction, the role will be air show planner, specifically air operations, and the human factors we're going to discuss are the communication or the lack thereof, the decision-making processes, and task saturation in a specific scenario. And for a preview, consider this to look in the frame of pre-show arrival, so when all the performers are starting to arrive to the show. Specific event was an air show that I was a part of the planning team for, and it was for our show back on April 10th of 2025 when everybody started to arrive. Specifically, the team was the F-22 Raptor demonstration team for this scenario, and typically they're parked at show center if they're the headliner, which was our headline act. But it was determined on our side that it was best to park them in the hot ramp area near hangars, and we'll discuss that on the next slide. And during the pre-arrival coordination with the team, it was assumed that this had been communicated clearly that we were not going to be able to make show center happen, but that we had an alternate plan due to some considerations of the wingtip clearances and things like that. And then our local crew from our base basically went out, picked up the F-22s, refueled them on the way, brought their maintenance and equipment, as well as everything else that they needed to support their performances. And upon landing, though, at the airfield, it seemed that communication had not happened with the team, and so we had to figure out a solution. So here's a picture of our ramp diagram for the show. So this arrow is from the hangar where we were going to have them staying overnight and then tow them out to this location. This is where we're going to have them parked, because from our understanding this is what we were going to have to do, but there was a breakdown in communication from our side because this is show center over on the left side of the photo, and this is where they were wanting to be parked for the duration of the show. So some considerations and second and third order effects of what would come from this. So the problem with show center from our perception was the taxiway wingtip clearance for a B-29 that we had as a performer. So that's the top left photo, very wide wingspan. And from what our measurements look like, it wasn't going to be clearing enough to be able to clear the F-22s and the crowd line. And then there's also a security requirement for 5th generation aircraft or stealth fighters. And so we also had F-35s, that's the bottom left photo. They were participating in our air show, and so security forces were already having to work to maintain security of those aircraft as well as the F-22s. And so figuring out a solution for that was having the hangar. There were also towing considerations if the aircraft were going to be pulled out each day. And then crash, fire, and response had a drill, and that required them to respond for the drill or for a real crash. It would have to be within 60 seconds of the initial call. And so we were concerned with that, as well as fueling operations throughout the duration of the show. But for the result, once I got notified by the demo team commander for the F-22 that they requested to still be put at show center if any way possible, we worked as fast as we could to make sure that that happened, working with airfield management. And the team was very happy to be told they were going to be moving to show center. And so our crash, fire, and response during the practice day, they actually passed their drill with 2 seconds to spare because that little inlet of the map where I showed you where show center was, they had planned to utilize that to respond to a crash, and where the location for the simulation of the crash was right past where that taxiway was. And so whenever they sped their way and got close to the F-22s, they had to go very, very slow and basically lose a lot of time getting around them because that was where they had planned to go. But had I communicated that change with them ahead of time, they would have been able to adapt their plans. And then B-29 taxi spacing was also not an issue. So after working with airfield management, it was actually wide enough to get an entire C-5 through. So that was never a problem, but that was under our assumption. Fueling operations were completely seamless for the entire air show, and the security forces had no problem securing both 5th gen aircraft between the F-22 and F-35. They worked out a solid plan, and had we communicated that ahead of time, we would already have that plan in place upon the F-22 team's arrival. So looking at it from a human factors analysis standpoint and applying the ABCs of TEM as we learned in lesson 1. So for assessing this, we assumed that communication had happened when it actually never did, and we never verified. And then we also assumed on our side that ramp spacing was tight, but we never fully went over those numbers all the way through with airfield management. And then for balancing barriers, decision making specifically part of as a barrier, it was very rapid because all of the other performers were arriving at the same time, so we were trying to deal with things as fast as we could. And so getting the move to show center was a priority for us as our show headliner, but we also made that decision fairly uninformed as far as not communicating with the rest of the entities because there was just so much going on. We were task saturated. And in communicating threats and intentions, we obviously didn't communicate that decision with all parties. It could have been as simple as sending a message out on our staff group me of, hey, we're moving the F-22s to show center, make adjustments, or something of that nature. So that way, fire and rescue, maintenance, all the other parties, as well as infrastructure, were able to make the changes. And also we could have had the graphic updated. And then lastly, SOPs. So we had already planned to deviate from standard operating procedure, which was the F-22 team's manual, but that was part of that, as well as we also deviated from our approved ramp diagram. So these are all things that we could have considered before or even during the decision-making process of moving the F-22. And then for discussion prompts, so how might you specifically have better communicated this decision for the parking location? And another question on top of that is, what else specifically would you have done differently? How else would you have better communicated, and what tools might you have used? And then lastly, what would have been the best way to implement biblical clarity? So how could we have communicated this better? How would you have done it differently? And how would you have done it with clarity from a biblical perspective? On that, with clarity, it's defined as a state of having a full, detailed, and orderly grasp of something. And in 1 Corinthians 14:8, we read, "For if the trumpet gives an uncertain sound, who shall prepare himself to the battle?" Which means a muffled trumpet is useless. And so there's a lack of clarity in worship or in our daily communication. So closed loop communication avoids some of these common terms we use in the military as far as stovepiping, planning in a vacuum, tunnel vision. And so having closed loop communication enables that clarity. So that means you're not just focused on your own details, but that of everyone else, and communicating that more clearly. So in conclusion, communication is always key. And in order to do that, identify and understand second and third order effects of your decisions, utilize the ABCs of threat and error management proactively, and embrace clarity. So thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the lesson.